Good morning, and welcome to Podcasting 101, Part 1. My name is Trey Gwynn. I'm the Technology and Outreach Coordinator for the Rutherford County Library System. I don't currently have a podcast, but I have created, developed, produced, and co-hosted 3 podcasts, 2 personal and 1 professional. I'm also an avid podcast listener. This is a couple months old. I bet that the numbers are even more ridiculous. While that doesn't make me an expert, just like watching a bunch of TV doesn't make you a TV expert, I just think it's fun to keep track of this kind of thing. This was originally intended to be an in-person training, and hopefully we will return to doing that kind of thing in the future. I would like for this to be as interactive as possible over this medium. If you look at the description of this video, you will find a Google link that will take you to a worksheet that you can do along with me as I show you what the first class is going to be about. And of course, if you have any questions, just use the chat feature to ask them. I will address them. I'll take a couple breaks as we go along to address them, and then we'll have a period at the end just in case there are any last second questions. Now, the purpose of this class, this 3-part class, is to help you develop, produce, and distribute your podcast over 3 1-hour sections. If you have an idea for a podcast, these classes are intended to help you turn it from an idea into reality, from start to finish. As an aside, I will say this: I can help you create a podcast and develop it and distribute it, but I cannot help you make it popular. If I had the secret knowledge that made podcasts popular, I could write a book that would get me millions of dollars. And if you crack the code, I would please share it with me, and I'll be glad to learn from you. But if you're seeking an audience, I can't help you with that. Now, very few mediums have democratized content quite as much as podcasting. Multi-million-dollar corporations are getting into the podcasting game, along with your average Joe Schmo. And unlike say like YouTube, which is a very democratic form of content creation, podcasting requires even less equipment. In part 2 here, I'll go ahead and go to the next slide just so I can kind of talk about this. But in part 2, we'll talk about production, and one of my key things that I will say about production is that each little increase in nicer equipment or more professional equipment will increase the product, the quality of the product that you're making. But that doesn't mean that without $100 microphone or something like that, you're cut out of the podcast game. And we'll talk about that in part 2. That this is something that can be done with a heavy blanket over your head to reduce echo, and the microphone on your phone, and a recording app. It's totally possible. People do it, and we'll talk about that in part 2. However, I am of the belief that before you even get started putting audio to tape, you need to spend some time thinking about the development of your podcast. So part 1 will be about development, part 2 will be about production, and then part 3 is distribution, which is both the most technical part of the of creating a podcast, and in some ways the easiest. 5 years ago, the distribution part was the hardest part, because the only way to do it was to either know how to use RSS feeds and some computer programming knowledge. Now there are places that do the distribution for you. So depending on how you want to distribute your podcast, you can just have them do it for you. But we'll talk about that in part 3. Part 1 is all about development. As I said moments ago, one moment, sorry, I've got to pull up my notes so that I'm all right. There we go. As I said moments ago, the first part of our class is going to be about developing your podcast. How do you go from the spark of an idea to actually creating a podcast? Again, it is my experience that before you ever put any audio to tape, it really helps you to take some time to establish the parameters of what you want your podcast to be, especially if you're going to ask other people to join you on your endeavor. Like I said, I have created 3 podcasts, 2 personal and 1 professional. The professional one was the one that went the smoothest when it came to development, because I was the only other people that were working on it were people that worked for me, so I got to control the vision, right? The personal ones, as much fun as I had making them, I'm not sure that I ever felt like I had I never felt like the vision that I had originally had came through, because I had too many cooks in the kitchen and I hadn't established what I wanted it to be firmly from the very beginning. And so today's class is going to be about working through the worksheet that I said is linked in the description of this video. If you want to pull that up, it is a Google Doc, so you should have access to it. But or you can just follow along with what we're talking about here on the screen. So after we have gone through all of these different steps, you should have a clear idea of what it is that you want your podcast to be, how what form it's going to take, that kind of thing. So first, we need to talk about your topic. The great thing about podcasts is that there's literally podcasts about everything. All subjects are on the table. Even things that you wouldn't think would lend themselves well to an all audio medium. There are podcasts out there about them. I checked this a couple months ago when I first did this class, or when I most recently did this class, and there are podcasts out there on like quilting and making quilts, and you'd think that wouldn't translate very well to audio, and honestly I didn't listen to them, so I don't know how well it did, but they exist. So that's one of the nice things about podcasts, is that because we're taking literally every subject and putting it on the table, if you have something that you're passionate about, you can make a podcast about it. The flip side of that coin is that, because again, a very democratized medium where there's a lot of people making podcasts, that means that you're likely going to have some sort of competition. So if you take a moment to think of a topic, it doesn't have to be a realistic one. It doesn't have to be the one that you're actually planning on doing. But as we're moving forward, think of a topic. Put just kind of have it in the back of your mind as we go through each of these steps, to think about how you would develop that topic into a podcast. So once you have your topic, you need to find your niche, right? First, you need to do some research. What podcasts already exist that focus on your topic? You can do a cursory Google search. You can pull up whatever your podcatcher app is that you plan on using, whether that's Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts, or whatever podcatcher you're going to use. And search your key term of, let's say quilting or whatever, and find out what podcasts exist on that topic. If you don't find anything, then great. You can craft it however you want. You really need to find a special niche, because the very fact that your podcast exists is your niche. Now, likely you are going to find other podcasts that exist that cover the topic that you want to do. So the next step is to take some time to think about what you can bring to the topic that other existing podcasts don't. So whether that's a different voice on the same topic, like from a different perspective, or a different way of, a different angle of looking at the topic, or a different format, like there's a bajillion video game podcasts out there, but say you wanted to do a video game podcast, but you're also you're an English major or something like that, you could do a video game podcast that looks at video games through literary analysis. Now, I don't think that would be I think that'd be a good podcast, but I bet that there's already podcasts doing that out there, but that's just something I came up with off the top of my head. So what you're doing is you're taking the core of an idea, the topic, and whittling it down into something that makes you unique, right? Something that positions you well to build an audience and brings your voice out of the den of hundreds of thousands of other people's voices. And that's super important, because otherwise why would people listen to you as opposed to someone else's already established podcast? Once you've done that, once you've found your topic, found your niche, then you need to spend some time thinking about your format. And there are as many podcasts as there are stars in the sky, and there are as many there are just as many formats. They're kind of like snowflakes. There are very few that are even very similar, because they all have their weird quirks and stuff like that. But I and maybe this is oversimplifying, but I have narrowed it down into 6 styles of podcasting, 6 different kinds of formats. There's the panel discussion, where that's some number of people, 3 or 4, some number of people more than 2, discussing something, whether that's comedy or advice or like a free-flowing discussion of news. You have your panel discussions. The vast majority of podcasts that are being created are this style of panel discussion. You have live style interviews, and that's interviews that are not heavily edited. So it's just the pure audio of one person talking to another person. You have news podcasts, where it is a more traditional style media news, and that's a growing sector in the podcast market. You have edited interviews, so like interviews where someone has taken an interview and chopped it up and moved it around and added narration, and so you're probably the most famous of those is This American Life, but there's a whole bunch of others like 99% Invisible, and there's a whole and there are different ones from different for different topics. You have Scripted, which is another growing segment of podcasts, where it's a usually these are narrative podcasts that are acted out using a script, and then I've just put everything else into another category where it's just there are these one-off podcasts that are doing their own thing, so that's just a big bucket of everything else, I guess. But the great thing about podcasts, the great thing about all media, but because podcasts are such an easy thing for people to get into, using relatively easy to find tools, is that you can play around with the format in a way that allows for a lot of experimentation, and that means that if you have some idea about a way to change the audio format into something that no one else is doing out there, then you can totally do that, because you don't have sponsors that you need to appease, and you don't have a like if you wanted to make a TV show, in order for the TV show to get out there, you'd have to work with a network, right? And while there are podcasting networks, they're not a choke point that keeps people from putting out podcasts, and so that means that if you want to experiment, this is a great place to do it. So once you've actually, before we talk about tone, just for a second, does anybody have any questions so far? Like I said, you can just type them into the YouTube chat, and I'll be happy to answer if I have an answer. I'll give you a second. And I will say, I forgot to mention this, but each of these, for each of these 6 formats that I have highlighted, I threw up the picture, the podcasting, like the thumbnail for different examples of the medium. These aren't the most popular. They're not necessarily the most pure examples of each of the formats that I highlighted, but they are examples of each of those types of formats. So I did get a question that said, would D&D podcasts fall into the other panel? Yeah, that's where I put those, although that is such a growing group of podcasts that as I do this class more often, I might have to do, those are called actual play podcasts, where someone plays like a role-playing game like Dungeons and Dragons or other. I'm not much of a tabletop nerd, but the one on my slide is the image there is from the Adventure Zone, which is done by the McElroy brothers, and it is a Dungeons and Dragons podcast. Like I said, that's a growing segment of podcasts, and it's not quite scripted, and it's not quite panel discussion, so that's why I put it in the other. So let's let's move on to the next segment. The next thing that you need to decide is what is your tone going to be, and just like with everything else that we've talked about, the world is open to you. You can be serious, you can be humorous, you can be flexible. Where you go from being serious to humorous, it's just that and so anything is on the table. But my suggestion would be that just like everything else that we've talked about, you decide this before you start recording. And that doesn't mean that you can't change it up, but especially if you're involving other people, because podcasts are generally a collaborative effort. That is not 100% true all the time, but there are solo podcasts, but it is hard to fill even a short period of time as just one person, especially if it's going to be different every time. Like I've taught this class 3 or 4 times, and so I'm happy to do it solo. But like if I had to come up with a new one of these literally every week, where it was completely new content, you see how that's getting more and more difficult. Now imagine if it was 100% off the cuff and extemporaneous, like most podcasts are. So that's why most podcasts have multiple people on them, which again is why I think that this process of development is so important, and finding all these different pieces is so important. So you need to take some time to find your tone and define what your tone is going to be. Are you going to try to keep it light, or are you gonna be serious? Are you going to be super candid about stuff? Are you gonna use your real name? Are you going to mention your partner? If you have kids, are you going to say their names on the podcast? These are all things you need to think about, because they are things that other podcasters have learned to think about, because the internet can be a scary place, and so you just need to think about how your tone is going to work, how much you're going to reveal about yourself, and that kind of thing. Speaking of, you then need to find your voice, and I was kind of alluding to this a minute ago, but there are podcasts from everything from one person speaking into a microphone to upwards of 5 or 6. I think you could probably do more than that, depending on what kind of style you're doing. Like if it's a scripted podcast, you could do way more than 5 or 6. But if it's, say, like a panel discussion, 5 or 6 is probably the upward limit, in my opinion, before it starts to all kind of break down and you have people talking all over each other, or you have people who are there but barely getting in a word edgewise. But the thing about this step is that you need to decide whether or not you think you're involving collaborators who are bought into the process, right? A solo podcast is hard, and a solo podcast limits what your style can be. Again, not everybody can get on and do extemporaneous talking for 30 minutes once a week. So a solo podcast where it's heavily scripted might be better. But that would be better than trying to involve people who aren't bought into the process, right? If you decide that you're going to make a panel discussion podcast, but then all of a sudden your would-be collaborators, they're not doing prep work, or they're not taking time out of their schedule to record, or if you're doing all of the work, that's no fun. And so these are all things you need to think about when you're thinking about finding your voice. It's more than just deciding what when you add people it is more than just deciding what style you're going to be when it comes to the number of people involved. It's a huge consideration has to be, are these people that you can rely on to participate, to be involved in the process? Are you going to be the only one editing the podcast? Are you going to be paying for the storage and the online storage for the podcasts? If it's essentially you doing all of the work solo, and then once a week they come in and record and then do nothing else, maybe you should just make a solo podcast. So these are just things you need to think about, right? Now, speaking of, you need to think about your length, because that is going to determine not only what you not only the style that you're going to do, but how you're going to implement your podcast, right? Again, it can be hard to do a 30-minute extemporaneous podcast. It can because when you're talking extemporaneously, it is easy to let that bloat, right? Because you're not scripted. So if it's going to be really short, I would suggest that you script it. If it's going to be really long, I suggest that you script it. So there's kind of this threshold of in between, right? Of if it's really short, you should probably script it. If it's really long, you should probably script it. If you're going to do like a panel discussion, then you're probably safe to do 30 minutes to an hour to 2 hours if you want. Now I have broken down podcast lengths into 3 distinct categories, right? There's the short podcast, and that is 30 minutes or less. A lot of your news podcasts are 30 minutes or less because they want people to listen to them like first thing in the morning, right? The one that I have linked here is the Memory Palace, which is actually a history podcast that is kind of this heavily scripted, beautiful narration of historic events. Then so you've got short podcasts, and then I would say you have long podcasts. Those are anything from 1 hour to 2 hours. Almost everything, I'm guessing, but I would guess that about 70% of podcasts that are created fall into that category. And then my third category is just Dan Carlin. He deserves his own category, and so anything that is 2 hours or 2 hours to infinity, I just call Dan Carlin as the third length. He is I don't know, he's a machine. I don't really listen to him anymore, but he does multiple podcasts where it is literally just him speaking into a microphone about a historic topic or political science or something like that. And it is scripted, but it doesn't feel scripted. And some of them are 6 hours, but I don't know how he does it, and I don't know how it's even listenable, but somehow it is. It's pretty incredible, but I just think that he deserves his own category. Once you've determined all that other stuff, so just kind of as a recap, actually, let's go. You find your topic, you find your niche within that topic, you find your format, you find your tone, you find your voice, you find your length, then you find your schedule. And there are literally podcasts that run on every schedule. I have put 4 here, but there are others. You could be a daily podcast. Again, a lot of the news podcasts are daily podcasts. You could be a weekly podcast. I would guess that about like 70% of podcasts out there are weekly. There are a lot of podcasts out there that are bi-monthly, so they're 2 a month. And then there are even podcasts out there, or at least one podcast out there that is a yearly podcast where it comes out once a year. However, there are also podcasts that are on their own schedule, where it's just when they make a new one, they make a new one. And it could be 2 days between podcasts, or it could be several months. And that is fine. My argument would be that a regular schedule will help you gain a consistent audience. So as long as you're clear about that schedule, even if it's every other month, even if it's every Monday and Tuesday, or no, that wouldn't make any sense. Well, I mean, you could do that, but I meant to say Monday and Thursday, because there are podcasts that do that too, where they're multiple times a week. Regardless, whatever your schedule is, let the audience know so that they can be anticipating the next podcast. Or, like I said, a regular schedule will help you gain a consistent audience. Those podcasts that are out there that don't have a regular schedule tend to be podcasts where one of the people on the podcast is famous, and so the fact that they put out a new episode is enough to get people to come back into it, and take a listen. That is not 100% true, but they tend to be, or it tends to be true. So unless you all are secretly famous, my suggestion would be to have a regular schedule that you consistently upload new podcasts on. The next thing that you need to do is find your name. Oh, I'm sorry. I've got a question. So is it the limit on the producers or the demand in the market for podcasts that causes most to be weekly? No, I think that it's just that is... I think that is just it is the model that has carried over from television shows. That would be my guess. If you have the time, because yes, there is some stress, or not stress, but demands, production demands. If you're doing anything other than just recording something and then putting it directly out to people, if there's any editing involved, it does take some work. So I think like a daily podcast would be a lot of work unless you're getting paid to do it. But if you're just an amateur, I feel like a weekly podcast is a pretty good. Was a weekly podcast was adopted from the world of television, because that's just a pretty good rhythm to be in, because you can record, I don't know, let's say you put out a new podcast on Wednesdays, you can record on Monday, edit on Tuesday, put it out on Wednesday. It's easy to get into that rhythm, and it's a rhythm that people are already familiar with from other mediums. But again, the great thing about podcasts is it's a place where you can experiment. I listen to at least 2 podcasts that do like a Monday podcast and a Thursday podcast. So if you wanted to do like if you wanted to try to break the mold when it came to your schedule, again, as long as you are transparent about it to your listeners, that's all that matters. Or it's not all that matters, but you know what I'm saying. Like that is probably the most important part of when it comes to scheduling. Now here comes one of the fun parts, although it can be a little frustrating, and I'll explain why that is. But once you've done all that other stuff, you can actually take some time to think about what kind of name you want for your podcast. And obviously there are plenty of options. You could make it funny, you could make it clever, you could make it practical. the obviously a lot of that will be set by the tone that you decided earlier. So obviously you wouldn't want to have some sort of name that is built on a pun if your podcast is going to be a very serious podcast. That probably wouldn't jive. I feel like anytime I'm thinking about podcast names, I'm always mine always tend to be like in the clever category, just because I don't know, I like wordplay, I guess. But it could always just be practical. So like if you're an insurance agent and you want to start a podcast on insurance and like the best insurance for different people, you could just call it Trey's Insurance Podcast, and that's a very practical name. There's nothing wrong with that. However, once you've settled on a name, you do need to take some time to check to see, but like before you really embrace it, before you start making logos or merchandise or whatever, you do need to make sure and take some time to make sure that no one else is out there using that name. When I worked for the Hermitage, we were making a podcast that was Andrew Jackson centric, and we came up with multiple names that we really liked, but every single time that we were about to move forward, we did a Google search and found that someone else was already using that name for a podcast. Jackson is famous for having been the first president to have what people call the kitchen cabinet, which is a cabinet within the cabinet of advisors, and sometimes people from outside of the cabinet that he listens to more than anybody else. And so the original name for the podcast was the Kitchen Cabinet, but some BBC podcast was using that name, and so we couldn't use it. And we went through 3 or 4 different iterations of names until we settled on POTUS 7, which is kind of more in that practical realm than I would have preferred. But you have to use what's available to you. But once you have a name that you like, do a quick Google search. Check out Apple Podcasts, check other podcatchers like Pocket Casts and stuff like that, just to make sure that someone else isn't using it. And then, of course, one of the things that you can look to see is, I don't remember what the statistic is, but the vast majority of podcasts never make it beyond their 10th episode. And so if there's a podcast that's using a name that you really like, and they haven't updated since 2013, then you could probably move forward with using it. You might just have to change the spelling or something, or you might have to work around it, but you'd still use that name somehow. My final step for part 1 of this class is to find your flexibility. If you're enjoying yourself but it isn't working, and whether that's and when I say it isn't working, whether that's not finding an audience or not the schedule that you've set up isn't working, whatever the case, if you feel like it isn't working, feel free to shake things up. Again, one of the brilliant things about this is that unless you become very popular, you won't have sponsors that you need to keep happy. You won't have a network that you need to keep happy. So change the formula. Change things up. If you decided to do a Dungeons and Dragons actual play podcast, and you're and it's not working, change the dungeon master. Switch to someone else being dungeon master, or switch to Pathfinder, or if you're, I guess. Again, I'm not much of a tabletop person, but if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons and you're not developing an audience, then switch to switch from fantasy to sci-fi. Whatever. take suggestions. One of the things that we'll talk about is in our next class in part 2 is take the time to make burner episodes. And by that I mean make episodes that almost no one is going to hear. Practice episodes, right? And I know that feels like a lot of work for something that no one is ever going to hear, but it allows you to practice the method by which you're going to make podcasts. Take those episodes and give them to people whose opinions you trust, and say, please, I know that I know that you're busy, and I know that you already listen to a bunch of podcasts. Please just listen to the first episode of my podcast. No one else is going to hear it. I just need your criticism of it, right? And listen to that criticism. Don't become so precious about the format that you've chosen. I said that the reason that we needed to go through these steps was to make sure that your vision is executed right, because you need to have a clear idea of what your vision is. But that doesn't mean that if someone comes to you and says, okay, look, this segment that you're doing on X just isn't working, that doesn't mean that you need to just ignore them. It is only when you have a clear idea of what your vision is that you can take that kind of criticism into account. And so be willing to listen to that criticism. So like I said, that is what we're covering in part 1. I know that every time I've taught this, there are people who think that we were going to be talking about like how to record and stuff, and we'll cover that in part 2 next month. But I think that this is a really important first step, no matter what kind of podcast you're going to end up making, because you need to take some time to think through your think through what kind of podcast you're going to make and what it's even going to quote unquote look like, or I guess sound like. So are there any questions before we wrap up? And while you type them out, I'm going to find the date for next month's class. And I'll put that up there. Oops. All right, so let me make this look okay. Boom. Okay. So February, the second part of our class will be taking place on February 12th, 2021, same time, 10 o'clock, same method. I'll send out a link. I'll try to do the day before. I forgot to do it yesterday. And we'll be covering production. We'll be talking about what resources the library actually has that can help you produce your podcast, because we do have 2 recording studios that are available to our patrons. So that's something we'll talk about. And of course, if you're here for this class, that means that you likely have my email address. So if you have any questions, let me know. Also, if you want to review what we talked about today, I'm going to edit it and put it up on our Facebook page, and so it'll be available to you there. Have a good day, and thanks for joining us. Bye.